Hello and welcome to Larry Has Opinions. You know that I don't really do TBRs, I don't really do monthly wrap-ups or anything. However, for June, I've decided to do a brief summary of what I've read during the month. I'm probably not going to keep this up for the next months, but we'll see how it goes. The first book I completed in June is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. I have a full spoilery review on the channel, so please go watch it if you're interested and you haven't watched it already. But it's a really famous revenge story. It has inspired endless movies, retellings, musicals even. So it's a really, really famous story. It's all set in the 1800s and against the backdrop of the transition between the Empire and the Republic with all that political drama in the background. But the story revolves around the main character and how he takes revenge onto the people who conspired against him. I rated this 7 out of 10, so it's a book I quite enjoyed, and I definitely admired all the weaving of the plot and the storytelling and a lot of the historical setting. It's definitely been quite enjoyable. However, I have to say that there were quite a few things that didn't completely work for me. First of all, just the sheer size and the length of it. As I said in my review, I sort of wish that I picked up an abridged version. It seemed like there were quite a few chunks of the story that were not necessarily that useful to the plot overall, that could have easily been left out. And in the context of how this was published as a serialized story, not as a unified novel, and also because of the way they were being paid in those days by the line, you can see how Dumas would have tried to stretch the size of the story as much as he could get away with. So for that reason, and some other more minor aspects of the story, I guess, I definitely rated it down versus what I was sort of expecting. I was hoping this would be like a 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 even, given it's so many people's favorite book ever. I had really high expectations and it slightly left me disappointed. I overall still enjoyed it. As I said, 7 out of 10 is not a bad rating for me, but slightly let down, let's put it that way. After that, I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I really enjoyed this book. It's a fantasy book. It's a very unusual setting for a fantasy story. I would say it's the intersection between fantasy, literary fiction with a small element of mystery. But one of the things I enjoyed the most wasn't really the mystery aspect of it, which is sort of predictable. And I heard some people saying they didn't like the book because of that, because they could see things coming. And I think it's supposed to be that way, in my opinion. The mystery, the more interesting mystery, if you like, is figuring out what's going on. The first couple of chapters where you follow this character called Piranesi in this really unusual setting where there is this really impressive house with a lot of statues, with these big alleyways and corridors and really wide rooms, and where he's essentially alone except for another person and some corpses, and just trying to figure out exactly what's happening. I found that really compelling. And the moment it started to slightly lose me after probably 40% into the book, when things started to get slightly repetitive and the plot picks up a little bit, and I have to say I was quite entertained throughout the whole story. It was very enjoyable. I rated this 8 out of 10. So it wasn't necessarily one of my favorite reads ever, but it was definitely very, very enjoyable. The reasons why it's not like a 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 is probably because the ending felt a bit too neat for the story. It's a very unusual story with a lot of interesting themes. And I was sort of hoping, given all the ambiguous nature of the story, I was hoping for more of a David Lynch-ish sort of ending, a bit of a messy ending, or not a clean ending, let's put it that way. Whereas the conclusion of the story is very tidy, with a bow on top, or at least that was my impression. That's one of the reasons why I haven't ranked it even higher. And secondarily, perhaps because it didn't necessarily feel super memorable. Again, it's a bit early to judge that, given that it's just been 3 weeks. It might be that 1 year down the line, I'm going to look back and remember Piranesi with a lot of fondness. So I don't know. But I'm getting the feeling that it might not be one that sticks with me for a very long time. Anyway, 8 out of 10 is a great rating for me. I really enjoyed the story. I would definitely recommend it to anyone who's kind of interested in that more literary fantasy, or perhaps like literary fiction and want a bit of a magical element to the story. The third book that I finished in June is Small Pleasures by Clare Chambers. And this is historical fiction. It's all set in the 1950s in the suburbs of London, in the southeast of England. I have a full review for this book, non-spoiler review, so if this piques your interest, please go watch it. It's a very unusual story. We follow Jean, who's a journalist in a local newspaper. So you can just imagine how in those days, women journalists would not necessarily have a lot of responsibility in terms of the breadth of articles and stories that I would be able to cover, especially working for a local newspaper. But one day they receive a letter by a woman who claims to have given birth by parthenogenesis, which means without having had intercourse with a man. And Jean gets the chance to investigate this story. And the story moves on from that, but she ends up getting quite attached to the family she's investigating. It's a really gentle story. There's no like epic heroes or anything. We follow someone who could have been your next door neighbor in those days. But it's a really gentle story with a lighter and dark tone at the same time. If you read it, you might see what I mean. I rated this 9 out of 10. So it's definitely been one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year. And it's one I would definitely highly recommend for anyone who enjoys historical fiction, or perhaps is interested in that time period in England, or also anyone who just enjoys a smaller story, a gentler story with really strong characters and a really nice setting. This was also longlisted for the Women's Prize. It didn't make the shortlist, but that definitely attests to the quality of the writing. The fourth book that I completed in June is The Employees by Olga Ravn, I think. This is translated from Danish, and it's at the intersection between science fiction and literary fiction, I would say. It's also in a very unusual format. So it's all in, I think you might be able to see, like it's all told in the way of individual statements, each made by different employees. And some of these are made by actual humans, and some are made by humanoids. But it's not necessarily obvious who is giving which statement, which is quite interesting. And this is all in an undefined future on board of a spaceship where human and humanoids are coexisting. And it's a very interesting reflection on that sort of enclosed society with rules imposed from above and just accepted. It's a very unusual story in a very unusual structure. This was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. She writes a lot of poetry as well, I understand. So that definitely shows in the book, because the writing itself is definitely really beautiful. However, I have to say that the story overall didn't fully work for me. It definitely has a lot to say for such a short book. However, I don't know, it just left me a little bit wanting, and it felt slightly flat for me. So I rated this 6 out of 10. So I didn't hate it or anything. I can definitely see how a lot of people who are more interested in perhaps some of the subtler aspects of the book might enjoy this. But I think for a general audience, it might be a bit niche. And lastly, I read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. This is quite famous, won the Booker Prize a few years ago. I can't remember exactly what year. and it's historical fiction around the Tudor era in England in the 1500s. But this is all told from the perspective of Thomas Cromwell, who is often portrayed as a ruthless, not necessarily super ethical person in any depiction of the story of the era. But somehow Mantel manages to make you root for this character, not because he's portrayed in a sort of Abercrombie-like manner where you get attached, but you're fully aware of how evil this person is. You just see someone who's just getting on with his life from very humble origins, manages to make it up all the way to serving the king and being the most important politician really in the country at that time. And what an achievement that would have been. And that doesn't necessarily imply nefarious intent on his part, but simply perhaps a personal ambition. I didn't fully appreciate Mantel's writing. I have to say it was really great in some way because of the way she uses punctuation and dialogue, the way it's written, and the way she refers to Cromwell as he, even though a lot of other people are also referred as he, and quite often it's not clear who he is. Is she talking about Cromwell? Is she talking about someone else? Sometimes it's really confusing, especially initially. It takes a little while to get used to it, and then when you think you've got the hang of it, still you manage to be thrown off again and again. So I didn't quite appreciate that. However, it's undeniable that the story, the idea, the prose, with the exceptions that I've made, and just how vivid this portrait and these characters are in the story is just masterful. And I rated this 9 out of 10, and I definitely intend to continue with the 2 next books. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please give me a thumbs up. Join our Discord, the link is down in the description, and I'll see you the next time.